Listen. Before we reveal who is stepping into your life next, take one slow breath and simply look at this card. Notice what your attention is drawn toward first. Is it the child, the flowers, the exchange between two people? Or perhaps it's the feeling of familiarity that quietly settles in your heart. The Six of Cups is not predicting your future. It is acting as a symbolic mirror for your inner world. This image to tell a story about emotional readiness, memory, and recognition. What's fascinating is that this card rarely appears as the beginning of a journey unless someone's energy has already started moving toward you. That means something has already shifted. Over the past few weeks, you may have found yourself thinking about old memories, reconnecting with forgotten hobbies, or suddenly remembering people you haven't spoken to in years. This isn't because you're meant to go backward. Quite the opposite. The Six of Cups represents the moment when your mind finishes processing an old emotional chapter so that it can recognize something entirely new. The person entering your life next will feel strangely familiar not because you've necessarily met before, but because they'll carry qualities that make your nervous system feel safe instead of anxious. Whoever is coming next isn't arriving to create confusion. They bring emotional consistency. They're someone who naturally gives without making generosity feel transactional. They listen before they speak, remember small details, and have a calming presence that makes conversations flow effortlessly. But here's the interesting part. The Six of Cups also asks one question. Are you ready to receive what you've spent so long trying to earn? Many people spend years believing love, friendship, or deep connection must be fought for. This card gently suggests that your next meaningful connection begins the moment you stop expecting every relationship to become another lesson. The flowers filling each cup symbolize growth that happened quietly, long before anyone noticed. In the same way, this connection has been developing beneath the surface through choices you've already made, even if you can't see the full picture yet. The person entering your life next may surprise you because your first reaction won't necessarily be butterflies or overwhelming excitement. Instead, you may notice something quieter. Your body relaxes. For someone who has spent time around emotionally unpredictable people, that kind of steadiness can almost feel unfamiliar at first. Your mind may briefly search for complications because that's what it learnt to expect. But little by little, your nervous system notices something different. Nothing feels forced. Nothing feels rushed. Nothing asks you to become someone else before you're accepted. The Lovers reminds us that genuine connection isn't built through emotional intensity alone. It's built through mutual regulation. One person's calm helps the other remain calm. One person's honesty invites honesty in return. Trust develops through dozens of ordinary moments that rarely seem remarkable while they're happening. Perhaps they're the type of person who remembers how you take your coffee after hearing it only once. Maybe they send a message when they say they will. Not because they're trying to impress you, but because reliability is simply part of who they are. They ask questions because they're genuinely interested in your answer, not because they're waiting for their turn to speak. When you share something vulnerable, they don't immediately try to solve it or change the subject. They stay present with you. Those moments seem small, yet they're exactly how emotional safety is built. That's why this connection may feel strangely familiar from the beginning, not because you've lived this story before, but because your heart recognizes the absence of unnecessary tension. The relationship doesn't demand constant decoding. You aren't trying to earn reassurance every few days. You simply begin relaxing without realizing it. And that's where the Lovers offers another quiet insight. But there is one detail hidden within this card that reveals something even more distinctive about who they are. And once you notice it, the entire picture begins to change. The person entering your life next doesn't appear grounded because life has always been easy for them. Their steadiness has been built through experience. They've discovered that reacting immediately doesn't always create understanding. They've learnt that listening is often more powerful than winning an argument. And they've realized that relationships become stronger when two people feel heard instead of simply trying to be right. Notice how different that feels from emotional unpredictability. When something goes wrong, they don't immediately assume the relationship is falling apart. If plans need to change, they communicate instead of disappearing. If there's a misunderstanding, they're more interested in understanding your perspective than collecting evidence that they're correct. That doesn't mean they never feel frustrated. It means they've learned that frustration doesn't have to control the conversation. In many ways, this quietly connects back to the Six of Cups. That earlier card invited you to recognize emotional familiarity through safety. The Hermit now expands that idea by showing where safety often comes from. It comes from someone who has already spent time understanding themselves. They're comfortable saying, I need a little time to think about that. They're equally comfortable saying, I was wrong. Neither statement feels like weakness to them. Instead, both become expressions of trust. You may even notice that they don't feel the need to impress everyone they meet. They're thoughtful before they speak. They choose their words carefully, not because they're guarded, but because they've learned that honest communication deserves patience. There's a quiet confidence in that, not the kind that fills every silence, the kind that isn't afraid of silence. And strangely enough, that's often what makes people feel comfortable opening up around them. As you spend more time reflecting on this card, another pattern begins to emerge. For someone who appears so emotionally steady, there is still one part of their inner world they protect very carefully. It's not insecurity in the way you might expect. It's a quieter fear, one that has quietly shaped nearly every meaningful connection they've had. And once you recognize what that fear is, you'll understand why meeting you could feel just as significant for them as it does for you. The Nine of Swords reminds us that emotionally healthy people aren't people who have never struggled. More often, they're people who have spent time understanding the struggles they carry. Instead of pretending painful experiences never happened, they've slowly learned how those experiences shaped the way they love, trust, and communicate. That's the quiet strength this person seems to carry. Perhaps there was a time when they gave more than they received. Perhaps they trusted someone who slowly became emotionally unavailable. Or perhaps they experienced disappointment that taught them how painful uncertainty can become when it lasts for too long. The details themselves aren't what matter most. What matters is what those experiences changed. Rather than becoming emotionally closed off, they became more aware of how easily people can misunderstand one another. They began noticing the moments when someone seems unusually quiet. They gradually stopped asking, "Why did this happen to me?" Instead, they began asking, "What can this experience teach me about the kind of relationships I want to build?" That shift changes everything. It's also why this person may notice emotional details that others overlook. They recognize when someone suddenly becomes quieter than usual. They remember the conversations that mattered. They understand that reassurance is often most meaningful before someone has to ask for it. Not because they can read minds, because they've learnt how much those moments matter. If you've ever found yourself becoming cautious after disappointment, or wondering whether openness would only lead to another lesson, you may recognize something familiar in that pattern as well. In a quiet way, your own emotional growth may echo theirs. Not through identical experiences, but through a shared understanding that genuine connection feels different from emotional uncertainty. Sometimes the deepest sense of familiarity comes from realizing that another person has learned many of the same emotional lessons, even if the circumstances were completely different. And when two people begin speaking that same emotional language, recognition can arrive much faster than either of them expected. The question isn't only who this person is anymore. The greater mystery is when your paths are finally ready to meet. And perhaps that's why the timing matters just as much as the person. It's natural to look back and wonder why someone like this didn't appear years ago. After all, there may have been moments when you were hoping for exactly the kind of consistency we've been describing. Moments when you were ready to give your attention, your loyalty, or your trust, only to discover that the other person wasn't meeting you in the same place emotionally. It's easy to assume that the opportunity simply wasn't there, but emotional readiness often develops so gradually that we rarely notice it while it's happening. Take a moment now to look at the Knight of Swords. The first impression is movement. The horse surges forward, the wind pushes against the rider's cloak. Everything about the image seems urgent, as though the journey has only just begun. Yet movement never truly begins the moment we can see it. Long before the horse started running, someone made the decision to move. Direction came first. The visible action simply followed. Growth works in much the same way. Many of the changes that reshape our relationships happen quietly. Perhaps you became less willing to explain away inconsistent behavior. Perhaps you stopped feeling responsible for fixing every misunderstanding. Perhaps you learnt that setting a boundary isn't the same as pushing someone away. None of those moments usually feel dramatic while they're happening. They simply become part of who you are. Then one day, you notice that the kinds of conversations you enjoy have changed. The people who naturally remain in your life begin looking different. The qualities that once impressed you no longer feel quite as important. Instead, reliability becomes attractive. Kindness becomes noticeable. Emotional honesty begins to feel more valuable than excitement alone. That's what makes the Six of Cups such an interesting symbol. Rather than suggesting that life suddenly changes because of chance, it quietly points towards something completing within you first. As your inner expectations become clearer, your attention naturally begins recognizing different kinds of people. Not because the world suddenly filled with them, but because your understanding of what creates genuine emotional safety became more refined. Seen this way, timing becomes less about waiting for life to begin and more about gradually becoming able to recognize what truly fits. And that's where the story becomes even more interesting, because the next symbolic card doesn't focus on where either of you has been. It asks what happens when clear direction finally meets unmistakable momentum. The image of the Two of Pentacles feels very different now. A sense of no longer being in a rush. The infinity-shaped ribbon connecting the two pentacles reminds us that connection doesn't always begin with overwhelming emotion. Sometimes it begins with consistency. A conversation that lasts a little longer than expected. Someone remembering what you mentioned several days earlier. An easy exchange where neither person feels the need to impress the other. These moments matter because they allow trust to develop before expectation does. Instead of wondering what someone intends after every interaction, both people simply become a familiar part of each other's experience. That's often how emotional safety grows. Not through dramatic declarations, through repeated moments that quietly feel comfortable. You may even notice that the conversations themselves are surprisingly ordinary. Perhaps you begin talking while waiting for something. Perhaps you're introduced through mutual responsibilities. Perhaps a casual discussion slowly expands into topics that are more personal, without either of you planning for that to happen. Nothing feels forced. Nothing feels rehearsed. Each interaction simply makes the next one feel a little more natural. Real connection often develops while two people continue balancing their own lives, allowing curiosity to grow at a pace that feels emotionally comfortable for both of them. And that may be why this person is surprisingly easy to overlook at first. They don't arrive demanding your attention. They don't create unnecessary uncertainty. Instead, their presence blends so naturally into your life that the significance of the connection may only become clear after you've shared several conversations. And when we place one more symbolic card beside these, an even quieter pattern begins to appear, one that explains why the strongest connections often feel the least complicated in the beginning. The Six of Cups introduced emotional familiarity. The Hermit showed the quiet confidence that comes from knowing yourself. The Nine of Swords reminded us that difficult experiences can become sources of compassion rather than fear. The Two of Pentacles showed how trust often develops through ordinary moments. Now, the Sun asks you to notice something even simpler. How does your body respond when you no longer feel the need to protect yourself? That may become one of the earlier signs of this connection. Not excitement that keeps you awake wondering what they're thinking. Not uncertainty that sends you replaying every conversation. Instead, you may notice that after spending time together, you feel lighter than you did before. You aren't mentally searching for hidden meanings behind every message. You don't feel pressure to present the most interesting version of yourself. You don't leave the conversation wondering whether you said the right thing. You simply leave feeling understood. That difference can be surprisingly subtle. In fact, many people overlook healthy connections at first because they expect meaningful chemistry to feel overwhelming. They assume that constant emotional intensity is proof that something important is happening. But this card gently suggests another possibility. Sometimes emotional clarity is much quieter than emotional confusion. You may find yourselves laughing more easily than you expected. Silences don't become uncomfortable. Small conversations naturally become deeper ones without anyone forcing the moment. Both of you remain curious about each other, not because you're trying to create an impression, but because genuine interest has room to grow naturally. Notice how different that feels from trying to convince someone to stay interested. Nothing here asks you to perform. Nothing asks you to become more impressive. The connection simply gives both people permission to become more authentic. That's why the Sun is such a fitting continuation of this story. It symbolizes what often happens after emotional safety has had enough time to grow. People stop protecting themselves from possibilities that no longer resemble the past. And perhaps you'll notice another quiet change within yourself. Instead of constantly asking whether this person likes you enough, you become more interested in whether you genuinely enjoy being yourself around them. That question changes everything. Because the greatest challenge may never be recognizing someone who brings consistency, honesty, and emotional ease into your life. The greater challenge is allowing yourself to trust that a connection can feel this natural without waiting for unnecessary complications to prove that it's real. After everything we've explored so far, one question naturally begins to emerge. If this connection truly feels calm, consistent, and emotionally safe, will it immediately look important to you? Or will part of you continue searching for something more complicated? Many people who have experienced emotional inconsistency don't realize how deeply their expectations have adapted. When affection once felt unpredictable, unpredictability could slowly begin to feel familiar. When reassurance was difficult to receive, uncertainty sometimes became mistaken for excitement. Not because anyone wanted unnecessary complications, but because the nervous system often learns to recognize what it has experienced most often. That's what makes the Seven of Cups such an interesting continuation of this story. Notice how many different images compete for attention. In much the same way, our minds can generate countless interpretations before another person has even finished speaking. Perhaps they took longer than usual to reply. Perhaps they seemed distracted one afternoon. Perhaps one conversation felt quieter than the last. Almost immediately, the mind begins filling the empty spaces with possibilities. Maybe they're losing interest. Maybe something has changed. Maybe I misunderstood everything. Yet very often, those stories begin long before any real evidence appears. They're simply old protective habits trying to prepare us for disappointment before disappointment has actually arrived. Those habits once served an important purpose. They encouraged caution when caution was needed. They helped you notice emotional inconsistency. They reminded you to protect your own well-being. But as the Six of Cups has quietly suggested from the very beginning, not every new connection belongs to an old emotional chapter. Sometimes the greatest shift isn't learning how to trust another person immediately. It's learning to notice when your own imagination is writing a story that reality hasn't asked you to believe. That small moment of awareness changes more than it first appears. Instead of reacting to every uncertainty, you become curious. Instead of assuming the worst, you allow another conversation to happen. Instead of rushing to conclusions, you give understanding enough time to grow. And perhaps that single shift becomes the difference between overlooking a connection that feels quietly genuine and allowing yourself to experience it as it naturally unfolds, because the final symbolic card doesn't ask who this person is. It asks what becomes possible when, for the first time, you begin responding to the present instead of protecting yourself from the past. Who are you becoming because of the kind of connection you're finally ready to experience? That reminds us that lasting relationships are rarely built through one unforgettable moment. They're built through hundreds of ordinary ones. One honest conversation, one kept promise, one misunderstanding handled with respect instead of fear, one evening where both people simply enjoy each other's company without feeling the need to become someone they're not. Those moments seem almost too simple, yet they slowly create something that emotional intensity alone never can. A sense of security. Notice how naturally this completes the story that began with the Six of Cups. The first card asked whether you were ready to receive what you had spent so long trying to earn. Now this card quietly suggests that receiving isn't a single moment. It's an ongoing experience. Every time you allow yourself to believe consistent actions instead of waiting for hidden disappointment, every time you speak honestly instead of assuming you'll be misunderstood, every time you remain present instead of letting old fears write the next chapter, you're participating in the relationship you once hoped to find. That's the quiet transformation these cards have been pointing toward all along. Perhaps the greatest gift this person brings isn't simply companionship. It's the opportunity to experience yourself differently. You may discover that you're laughing without wondering when the mood will change, sharing your thoughts without rehearsing them first, looking forward to seeing someone without preparing yourself for disappointment. Little by little, trust stops feeling like a risk and begins feeling like a natural response to consistent care. Healthy love often feels surprisingly ordinary in the beginning. Not because it's less meaningful, because it leaves room for real life to exist. There is space for silence, space for honesty, space for imperfection, space for two people to continue growing without constantly questioning whether they're enough. And perhaps that's the quiet purpose behind every symbolic card you've seen today. None of them was trying to predict a stranger waiting somewhere in your future. Instead, each one reflected a different part of your own emotional journey. The Eight of Pentacles now leaves you with one final thought. The person entering your life may indeed become deeply meaningful. But the most important discovery has never been recognizing them. It's recognizing the version of yourself that no longer mistakes peace for something ordinary, and finally understands that the safest place for your heart may also become the place where it grows the most. Take one final moment to look at the Star. After every card we've explored together, it's fitting that this is where the journey gently comes to rest. Notice how peaceful the image feels. Nothing is being forced. Nothing is being chased. The figure simply pours water with complete attention, allowing each movement to happen naturally. If we think about this card symbolically, it doesn't speak about finding perfection. It speaks about returning to trust. Not blind trust. Not instant trust. The quieter kind that develops after you've learned enough about yourself to recognize what truly feels right. That's the thread connecting every card we've shared today. Perhaps the person entering your life isn't arriving to complete you. Perhaps they're arriving at a time when you're finally able to experience connection without constantly expecting it to disappear. That's a very different way of looking at love. It doesn't remove uncertainty from life, it simply changes your relationship with it. Instead of asking whether every interaction guarantees a particular future, you become more interested in how a connection feels while you're living it. You notice whether you feel respected, whether you're free, to be honest, whether peace becomes more familiar than confusion. Those quiet observations often tell us far more than dramatic first impressions ever could. So, if there's one thought to carry with you after today's reading, perhaps it's this. Meaningful relationships rarely begin with certainty. They begin with recognition. A recognition that something within you has changed. A recognition that emotional safety is no longer something you have to earn. A recognition that the healthiest connections often arrive so naturally that they almost seem ordinary at first. Thank you for spending this time with me and for sharing this quiet moment of reflection. I genuinely love to know what resonated with you the most today. Was there one card or one idea that stayed with you? Let me know in the comments. I always enjoy reading your thoughts and hearing how these symbolic stories connect with your own experiences. Until our next reading, be gentle with yourself, stay curious about the people and moments that bring you a sense of peace, and remember that sometimes the most meaningful chapter begins long before you realize you've already turned the page. I'll look forward to sharing the next journey with you soon.